It looked like a suicide. A young woman alone in her apartment, locked from the inside, a knife in her chest. But the moment detectives stepped closer, the truth fell apart. 20 stab wounds. No defensive wounds. No signs of a struggle. And a door that could only lock from the outside. What happened to Ellen Greenberg should have been obvious. Instead, it became one of the most disturbing puzzles in modern forensic history. A death-ruled suicide that almost no one believes was self-inflicted. This is the story of the silent suicide of Ellen Greenberg. A case that doesn't whisper, it screams. It should have been a simple scene. A quiet apartment. A locked door. A young woman found alone beside the kitchen counter. But nothing about what happened to 27-year-old Ellen Greenberg made sense, not to paramedics, not to investigators, and not to the forensic experts who would spend years trying to untangle the lies hiding inside a single Philadelphia apartment. Ellen was a first-grade teacher, bright, gentle, well-liked, the kind of person who baked cupcakes for her students and never raised her voice. She lived with her fiancé, Samuel Goldberg, in a luxury apartment complex in Manayunk. They were planning a wedding. She had just returned from school that snowy January afternoon, changed into comfortable clothes, and began preparing a simple pasta dinner. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. Just the normal rhythm of a normal day. But around 5:30 p.m., Samuel claimed he returned from the gym to find the apartment door locked, not with the regular latch, but with the swing bar lock, the kind that can only be engaged from the inside. He said he knocked. He called her name. He texted her. No answer. He grew frustrated, then panicked. He called building maintenance. He called her again. And finally, according to his statement, he kicked the door until the swing bar broke off, sending the door crashing inward. What happened next has been debated for more than a decade. Samuel told investigators he found Ellen slumped on the kitchen floor, sitting upright against a cabinet. A knife was buried in her chest. Fruit had fallen from a nearby countertop. A half-cut orange lay next to her. And her hair was still damp, as if she'd recently showered. He dialed 911 and told the operator she had stabbed herself. When the dispatcher asked if she was breathing, he wasn't sure. There was no mention of an intruder. No mention of a struggle. Just a quiet kitchen, a locked apartment, and a knife that shouldn't have been where it was. Paramedics arrived minutes later, and immediately realized something was off. Ellen's body wasn't just stabbed once. She wasn't even stabbed twice. She had 20 stab wounds, 10 in the back of her head and neck, 10 in her chest. Some were deep enough to pierce organs. Others were shallow hesitation marks. But there was no defensive damage to her hands. No bruising. No signs she'd fought for her life. To police, it was the perfect paradox, too many wounds for a suicide, yet no signs of a killer. Inside that apartment, everything felt frozen, like the room had been staged in the middle of a breath it never finished. Nothing was overturned. Cabinets weren't pulled open. Jewelry wasn't missing. No bloody footprints. No bloody handprints. Even stranger, the knife that killed her still had no fingerprints. Not Ellen's. Not Samuel's. Not anyone's. Detectives examined the entryway, expecting splintered wood from the forced door. Instead, they found almost no damage. The swing bar, the piece Samuel said he broke off, wasn't shattered or bent, just loosened, as if it had been unscrewed, not kicked. Crime scene photos would later raise even more questions. Did Samuel really break the lock? Or had it never been engaged at all? But the strangest detail of all came from the medical examiner. During the autopsy, Ellen's spinal cord had been punctured, meaning she would have lost mobility instantly. Yet multiple stab wounds appeared to have been inflicted after that debilitating injury. In other words, if Ellen did this to herself, she would have needed to continue stabbing her own back and head, after she could no longer stand, no longer lift her arms, no longer control her own body. The medical examiner's initial ruling was immediate: homicide. No question. No hesitation. 20 stab wounds and spinal damage do not match suicide. But then something happened, something Ellen's parents, her lawyers, and forensic specialists have spent years trying to explain. After a closed-door meeting with investigators, the medical examiner abruptly changed the ruling from homicide to suicide. The official reason? Because the apartment was locked from the inside, no one else could have entered. Forensic science was overridden by a locked door. Ellen's parents, Sandra and Joshua Greenberg, were devastated, and unconvinced. Their daughter had no history of self-harm. She had just signed a new teaching contract. She was planning a wedding. She'd bought groceries that afternoon. Her texts were normal, short, cheerful, nothing unusual. There was simply no explanation for a violent self-inflicted attack that defied physical possibility. As days turned into weeks, more contradictions surfaced. Crime scene photos showed dried, congealed blood, but Samuel said only minutes had passed before he called 911. The knife handle was improbably clean. Ellen had bruises on her body in various stages of healing. Her computer contained no searches for suicide methods. Her autopsy revealed 9 of the wounds were so deep they penetrated bone, including one strong enough to snap her rib. Yet investigators kept circling back to the same conclusion. Locked apartment. No intruder. Suicide. But experts disagreed, loudly. World-renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht reviewed the case and stated flatly: Ellen Greenberg did not, could not, kill herself in this manner. Other forensic experts echoed him. The wounds were too many. The angles were wrong. The spinal damage alone made self-infliction physically impossible. And the absence of blood trails suggested she never moved after the first few wounds. If she didn't move, someone else was with her when she died. Yet the official ruling remained unchanged. As pressure grew, Samuel hired a lawyer and refused further interviews. He moved out of the apartment soon after, remarried, and started a new life. Meanwhile, Ellen's parents began their own battle, not against a killer, but against a system determined to pretend one never existed. After the initial shock, Ellen's parents began pressing investigators for clarity. Why change the ruling? Why ignore the 20 stab wounds, the spinal damage, the lack of fingerprints, the clean knife handle, the contradictory lock evidence? Each time they demanded answers, they received the same response. Because no one else was inside the apartment. The locked door theory became the foundation of the entire suicide ruling, a foundation that would later be revealed as deeply flawed. Investigators assumed the swing bar lock had been engaged, but crime scene photos suggested otherwise. The lock was not broken off, as Samuel claimed. Instead, it hung loosely, screws stripped outward in a pattern that experts later said was consistent not with a forceful kick, but with simple dragging or repeated manipulation. In other words, Samuel may have fabricated his forced entry story, intentionally or not. Meanwhile, independent forensic specialists began picking apart the wounds themselves. Ellen had 2 stab wounds to the back of her neck so deep that they struck vertebrae. One punctured the cranial cavity, a blow that would have instantly incapacitated her. Yet she somehow managed to deliver multiple additional wounds afterward. Impossible. The angles were wrong. The depth was wrong. The sequencing was wrong. Ellen's parents brought in Dr. Wayne Ross, a board-certified forensic pathologist, to review the autopsy in detail. What he found changed everything. The wound that struck Ellen's spinal cord would have made coordinated movement physically impossible within seconds. She would not have been able to continue stabbing herself. She would not have been able to stand. She may not have even remained conscious. But more telling than the wounds on Ellen, was the absence of wounds around the apartment. No cast-off blood spatter from multiple stabbings. No blood-soaked footprints tracking movement. No handprints smeared on counters. No trail of drops from one position to another. Ellen's blood pool appeared where she was found, and only there. Which meant she was likely immobile when most of the wounds were inflicted. A final, devastating piece of forensic evidence came from the blood-soaked knife itself. Crime scene investigators found no fingerprints on it from anyone. Not on the handle. Not on the blade. Not smudged. Not partial. Not even wiped. It was, quite literally, a ghost knife, and in crime scene science, that only happens in one of two situations. Intentional cleaning. Or someone wearing gloves. Neither of which aligns with suicide. As the Greenbergs pushed for a reinvestigation, they uncovered another disturbing detail. Ellen's body had multiple bruises in various stages of healing, some days old, some weeks old. These were not minor bumps from furniture. Forensic analysis determined they were consistent with grab marks, the kind seen in domestic altercations. Yet investigators insisted Ellen showed no signs of abuse. Her parents disagreed. Friends disagreed. Medical experts disagreed. Even the timeline Samuel provided was riddled with inconsistencies. He claimed he left for the gym around 4:45 p.m. but could not provide verifiable timestamps of his movements afterward. Building surveillance cameras were not positioned to confirm his comings or goings. His behavior during the 911 call raised eyebrows. He never attempted CPR. He never mentioned a knife until asked. He repeatedly said she stabbed herself, despite having no medical training and no basis to conclude that. To many listeners, the call sounded less like panic, and more like careful framing. Yet none of this was enough for authorities to reopen the case. The more Ellen's parents pushed, the more pushback they encountered. Their lawsuit to change the death certificate was dismissed. Their requests for new analysis were denied. Their pleas for recognition of the forensic impossibility were ignored. It felt like the entire system had locked itself from the inside, an invisible swing bar no one could break through. Still, experts volunteered to help. Blood pattern analysts reviewed photos and concluded that Ellen had likely been moved post-injury. Neurologists confirmed the spinal wound would have dropped her instantly. Psychologists evaluated her mental history. She had mild anxiety, but no severe depression, no self-harm, no suicidal ideation, and no major life crisis. In fact, she had emailed her students that she would see them tomorrow. Her groceries were still in the bag. Her tea kettle was still warm. Nothing in her life suggested a suicide spiral. At this point, the story transformed from a mystery into a war. A war between science and bureaucracy, between forensics and institutional ego. Ellen's parents weren't just arguing against a theory, they were fighting an entire system unwilling to admit a potential mistake. Their struggle reached a turning point when their legal team discovered internal emails between medical professionals discussing the case. In one message, a pathologist wrote, "This does not appear to be a suicide." Another message indicated the medical examiner's office was under pressure to close the case. It was the crack in the door Ellen's family had been waiting for. But even with this evidence, Philadelphia's courts ruled the death certificate would remain unchanged. Not because the science supported suicide, but because the system deemed the original ruling final. Years passed with no movement, until 2021, when a judge finally allowed the Greenbergs' lawsuit to proceed. For the first time in a decade, the possibility of a corrected death ruling became real. The case was thrust back into the spotlight. Experts were re-examined. Evidence was re-reviewed. The public, once again, felt the weight of a case that refused to lie down quietly. Today, Ellen's death remains officially classified as suicide, but unofficially. Forensic scientists, medical experts, legal analysts, and millions of viewers around the world agree. Ellen Greenberg did not kill herself. Someone else was in that apartment. And the system may have helped that person walk away untouched. Her parents continue their fight, not for money, not for attention, but for a simple correction to the record. They want suicide replaced with the truth. Whatever that truth may be. In the end, this case doesn't settle. It doesn't fade. It doesn't slip quietly into the category of unsolved, because nothing about it was ever silent. Not the wounds. Not the evidence. Not the contradictions that scream louder with every page you turn. Ellen Greenberg's story is the kind that leaves a mark, not because we know what happened, but because we don't. Because something went terribly wrong in that apartment. And something went even more wrong in the investigation that followed. A woman with 20 stab wounds should not be ruled a suicide. A door that may not have been locked should not determine a cause of death. And a system that prides itself on precision should not crumble under the weight of its own assumptions. Her parents never asked for vengeance. They never accused anyone by name. They never demanded more than the truth. And yet, a decade later, they're still standing outside a locked door waiting for someone, anyone, to open it. Maybe the saddest part isn't Ellen's death. But how easily a life can be misfiled. How quickly a mystery can be labeled closed. How a story so loud can be silenced by a single word on a certificate. If justice means clarity, Ellen Greenberg has never received any. If peace means answers, her parents still wake up every day without them. And if the truth is somewhere in that apartment, it's still waiting for someone to look past the lock. And finally listen.